In the medieval world, the queen's power was never loud. It was not written in charters or spoken of in proclamations. It was never immediate, never overt. Queenship was a subtle art, woven into the tedious repetitions of daily court life. A queen's influence was not a sword drawn in anger, but a thread pulled carefully, day after day, until the entire tapestry of power shifted beneath it. To be a queen was to live in a constant performance, a relentless ritual of presence. Not to act, but to endure. Not to command, but to wait. The day for a medieval queen began early, though not with decisions of her own. The rhythm of her life was set by the expectations of others. In the first cold light of morning, her handmaids would arrive to dress her. The chamber was still and silent. The only sounds were the faint crackle of a small hearth fire, and the rustle of fabric being layered upon her body, linen chemise, woolen kirtle, silken surcoat. Each garment a barrier between her skin and the cold stone walls of her life. Each layer a reminder that her body was never her own, always a symbol, always watched. Breakfast was not a private affair. It was a ceremony. She sat straight back at a long wooden table where courtiers murmured petitions and advisors read reports in low, measured tones. The food was plain, the atmosphere suffocating in its formality. Every glance she offered, every nod of her head was observed, interpreted, noted. A smile, given at the right moment, could build an alliance. A silence, held for just a second longer than expected, could unsettle a rival. The queen did not speak often. She did not need to. Presence itself was a language if one was patient enough to let it speak. Throughout the long, dragging hours of the day, the queen would be seen at ceremonies, at church, at meals, at audiences with foreign envoys, but her true work was rarely visible. It took place in hushed conversations, in exchanges of small tokens, in the sending of letters sealed with careful words and softer implications. The queen's influence was a slow accumulation, like dust gathering in the corners of the castle. Imperceptible until it wasn't. Power in the medieval court was the game of patience. And the queen was its most enduring player. Kings rode off to war. Lords fell in and out of favor. Ministers schemed and were schemed against. But the queen remained. She sat at the king's side through countless feasts, through endless processions, through seasons that turned predictably, like the wheel of a cart. While others sought immediate victories, the queen played for longevity. She understood that true influence was not taken. It was grown, quietly, tenderly, like a vine creeping up a stone-walled dot in the private spaces. Of the castle, the gardens, the sewing chambers, the oratories, the queen's work continued. A whispered word here, a shared confidence there. Power was not only found in council halls. It was stitched into tapestries, disguised as idle gossip among ladies in waiting. Concealed in the delicate politeness of gift-giving, the queen's. Court was a net of relationships, each strand fragile on its own, but unbreakable in its entirety. To be a medieval queen was to understand the exhausting art of survival within rigid structures. Every movement, every word, every moment of silence had weight. Yet the victories she achieved were rarely dramatic. There were no declarations of triumph, no songs sung in her name. Instead, her influence manifested in the decisions of others, in subtle shifts of policy, in the softened tones of a once hostile lord, in the quiet realignment of loyalties. She did not strike, she endured, and, in enduring, she bent the course of history in ways that could not be easily undone. This series is not about battles. It is not about swords or sieges. It is about queens who waited, queens who watched, queens who listened. It is about Eleanor of Aquitaine, who moved from the stifling courts of France to the tempestuous politics of England, navigating each with the fluid grace of a woman who knew how to outlast kings. It is about Empress Matilda, who waged a civil war not by storming castles, but by surviving them, siege after siege, setback after setback, until time at last yielded to her claim. It is about Isabella of France, who endured humiliation and dismissal gathering allies in the shadows until her patience became a revolution. It is about Margaret of Anjou, whose battlefield was not a field of blood, but a drawing room cluttered with maps, coins, and the fragile agreements of men who underestimated her. Their stories are not loud. They unfold in whispers, in the soft echo of footsteps across stone floors, in the slow turning of parchment pages, in the countless small decisions repeated endlessly, which eventually coalesced into history. They did not shatter the structures that confined them. They reshaped them slowly, patiently, from within. As we walk through their lives in the episodes to come, we will not rush. We will take the long, slow path. We will move through cold, dim corridors. We will sit through tedious councils where every sigh and every pause is part of a silent contest of endurance. We will listen to the muffled whispers behind tapestries, where alliances are born not in passion, but in quiet pragmatism. There will be no climactic battles here, no sudden triumphs. Only the soft, inexorable advance of queens who knew that power does not always belong to the one who seizes it. Sometimes, power belongs to the one who simply refuses to let go. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Empress Matilda, Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, their names echo faintly through history, often overshadowed by the kings and lords who shouted louder in their own time. Yet it was these queens, with their patience, their quiet persistence, their mastery of soft power, who shaped the destinies of kingdoms. This is the story of queens who outwitted kings. In the quiet light of dawn. Beneath the high, vaulted ceilings of Aquitaine, a young Eleanor learned to walk with the weight of affectation draped across her shoulders. Not the heavy metal of a crown, nor the suffocating weight of armor, but something lighter, and yet far more enduring. The invisible fabric of lineage. The daughter of William X, Duke of Aquitaine, Eleanor inherited not just lands, vast, sprawling, unruly lands, but a legacy of courtly refinement poetry, and political entanglement that extended far beyond her duchy. In an age where women were often sidelined, her inheritance was a beacon, but also a burden. She would not wield a sword. She would wield patience. At the tender age of 15, Eleanor's life shifted from the lively courts of her homeland to the rigid ceremonial halls of France. Her marriage to Louis VII, King of France, was a union not born of love or personal choice, but of strategy. A duchess marrying a king, a bond meant to secure lands, to stabilize realms, to weave her lineage into the colder, more austere fabric of Capetian royalty. The transition was not a flight of romantic fantasy. It was a slow procession into a life of constant observation, where every glance, every whisper, every breath would be weighed and measured within the suffocating formalities of court life. The court of France was not Aquitaine. In Aquitaine, Eleanor had known a court alive with troubadours, poets, and the soft, subtle maneuverings of artful diplomacy. But in Paris, she found herself among stone walls that seemed to absorb sound rather than echo it. The courtiers here spoke softly, but with judgment. They watched Eleanor, the lively, richly dressed southern duchess, with narrowed eyes. Her silk gowns rustled a little too freely. Her laughter, though rare, seemed to disturb the sanctity of rooms where silence was expected. She was an outsider, but she endured. Eleanor quickly learned that queenship in France was not about issuing commands or enacting visible reforms. It was about presence, a constant, delicate presence that required no words, yet spoke volumes through patience. Day after day, she would take her place beside Louis VII in long, tedious ceremonies where decisions were rarely made, but where absence was as damning as scandal. Her power was not in what she could say, but in her ability to be seen, still, composed, enduring. As men spoke of matter she had already considered in silence, the young King Louis was not a man suited for power games. Pious, earnest, and somewhat naive, he viewed his queenship as a spiritual union, not as a political alliance. Eleanor, far more attuned to the delicate webs of influence, found herself constrained by his rigid morality. He sought simplicity. In a world of complexity, where Eleanor saw opportunities for subtle alliances, Louis saw only the path of righteousness. It was not a clash of tempers, but a slow divergence, two parallel lives unfolding beneath the same crown. Still, Eleanor waited. She observed, while Louis immersed himself in the affairs of monasteries and the high clergy. She cultivated relationships with the noble women of court. These were not idle friendships. Every embroidered tapestry shared, every candlelit hour spent in quiet conversation was an act of influence. Through these women, mothers, wives, sisters of powerful men, Eleanor extended her reach, delicately, patiently. She did not need to oppose the king. She only needed to be a constant, unwavering presence, weaving herself into the fabric of courtly life until her influence became undeniable. Though never loudly declared, the turning point came not in a throne room, but on the dusty, winding roads toward the Holy Land. The Second Crusade was not a romanticized adventure for Eleanor. It was, for her, a passage, a movement away from the stagnant air of Parisian courts toward new alliances. Could be formed under different skies. When Louis, driven by a desire for penance, declared his intention to take up the cross, Eleanor insisted on accompanying him, not as a passive companion, but as Duchess of Aquitaine, leading her own contingent, the image of Eleanor leading a procession of noble women, dressed in flowing silks and riding through the dust-choked landscapes of Eastern Europe, has often been romanticized and misunderstood. Chroniclers mocked the extravagance, failing to grasp the deeper significance of her presence. Eleanor was not there to wield a sword. She was there to be seen by kings, by lords, by patriarchs of distant courts. Each mile she traveled was a quiet assertion of agency in a campaign otherwise dominated by male ambition. The crusade itself was a long, exhausting failure. Battles were poorly planned. Alliances faltered. But Eleanor's focus was never on battlefield. She watched, listened, and took note of the fragile egos of kings and the fleeting loyalties of lords. In the court of Antioch, ruled by her uncle Raymond, she found a brief respite, a space where diplomacy and courtly culture resembled the lively world of her youth in Aquitaine. But even this would not last. Whispers of scandal, born of political insecurities rather than fact, soon forced Eleanor away from Antioch, back into the long, suffocating journey alongside a husband who no longer understood her. The return to France was not a triumphant homecoming. The failures of the crusade weighed heavily on Louis, but for Eleanor, the journey had been an awakening. She had seen the wider world beyond the cold. Etiquette of Paris. She had learned how fragile the structures of power were when removed from their stone enclosures. Her marriage to Louis, once a necessary alliance, now felt like an anchor. Their union had produced no male heir. Their conversations had dwindled into perfunctory exchanges. They shared a crown, but not a vision. Still, Eleanor did not confront Louis. There were no loud accusations, no dramatic separations. She simply began to retreat quietly, politely, into the periphery of his court. Her silences became longer, more deliberate. Where once she had sat beside him at councils, she now remained in her private chambers, embroidering with her ladies, receiving envoys in more intimate, controlled settings. Her influence did not vanish. It simply shifted into subtler forms. In 1152, after years of mutual withdrawal, the marriage between Eleanor and Louis was formally annulled. The official reasoning was consanguinity, the fact that they were distant cousins, but everyone understood the true reason: a queen who refused to be content with ceremonial presence, and a king who sought a companion in piety, not politics. But Eleanor did not fade into history. In fact, she moved faster than anyone expected. Barely 2 months after the annulment, she married Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. It was a union not of necessity, but of mutual ambition. Eleanor, seasoned by years of patient court life, recognized in Henry a restless, determined young man whose ambition stretched far beyond the boundaries of his duchies. Henry, in turn, saw in Eleanor not just a duchess of unmatched territories, but a political mind as sharp as any blade, encased in a queen's quiet composure. With her marriage to Henry, Eleanor became Queen of England. Yet her new title did not promises. The Plantagenet Empire was a complex, sprawling web of territories where loyalties shifted as quickly as tides. In these lands, the ceremonies were different, but the game remained the same. Influence still required patience. Power still moved slowly beneath the surface, and glances and whispers and the weight of quiet endurance. Eleanor adapted swiftly. She sat through the councils, listened to the feuding barons, endured the cold, damp processions across the English countryside. But now, she carried with her the lessons of Aquitaine and France. She continued to build her network, aligning herself with noble families through her children's marriages, ensuring her presence was felt in every corner of Henry's expanding empire. Each daughter she married off became a thread to Castile, to Saxony, to Sicily, binding faraway courts to her subtle will. Henry Plantagenet was no Louis. He was not blind to Leonor's influence, but he sought to contain it, to direct it. Their marriage, though filled with mutual respect, was a quiet contest of endurance. Henry governed through action. Eleanor governed through patience. As Henry's ambitions pulled him from campaign to campaign, Eleanor remained, a constant, quietly enduring presence in the courts he left behind. When Eleanor of Aquitaine set her eyes toward the Holy Land, it was not the gleam of conquest that filled her thoughts. The year was 1147. The drums of the Second Crusade echoed across Christendom, but Eleanor did not march to the beat of those drums. Her journey was a quieter one, a procession of silks and veils, of hushed prayers murmured beneath breath, and long hours of contemplation as the wheels of ox carts creaked along endless, dusty roads. The crusade would become many things for many. Men, a stage for valor, a theater of glory, a tragic miscalculation. But for Eleanor, it was something else entirely. It was a slow, deliberate extension of her influence into new realms, an arena where presence itself became a form of power. At the side of her husband, King Louis VII of France, Eleanor was seen, but not heard. The French court chroniclers, blind to the quiet strategies of queenship, often dismissed her participation as little more than a lavish pilgrimage. They noted the scandal of her entourage, noble women in silk-draped litters, their banners fluttering softly in the Mediterranean breeze. But they did not understand what Eleanor understood, that in a world of armored men, sometimes the rustle of a silk train could command more attention than the clash of steel. Her procession was a statement, not of defiance, but of endurance. She would not wield the sword. She would wield patience. The journey itself was a study in slowness. Days blurred into one another beneath the relentless sun. From Vézelay to Constantinople, from the shores of Anatolia to the halls of Antioch, Eleanor traveled not as a passive observer, but as a quiet diplomat. While King Louis obsessed over religious penance and military blunders, Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on the people around them. Nobles whose loyalties shifted like desert sands. Lords whose ambitions outgrew their oaths. Emissaries from distant. Courts who spoke in riddles and veiled promises. Each evening, as the campfires flickered and the camps settled into uneasy sleep, Eleanor listened. She gathered fragments of conversations, caught the half-said things left hanging in the air, and stored them in the vault of her composure. One cannot overstate the tedium of the Crusade's daily rhythms. There were no grand sieges, no thrilling advances for Eleanor to witness. Instead, there was dust. Dust that clung to the hems of her gown, to the intricate embroidery on her sleeves. Dust that blurred the horizon into a ceaseless, colorless haze. The journey from France to Outremer was not a march of triumph. It was a slow erosion of patience for many. But Eleanor thrived where others faltered. She knew that real power was not seized in moments of glory, but accrued in the in-between spaces, in the silences between councils, in the small exchanges behind heavy tent flaps. That her arrival in Antioch was a moment of quiet relief. Here, in the court of her uncle Raymond of Poitiers, Eleanor found a familiar rhythm. Antioch was not Paris. It pulsed with a different life, one that Eleanor recognized from her days in Aquitaine. There were minstrels in the halls, lords who spoke of poetry and politics in the same breath, and courtly rituals that valued wit over piety. It was here, for a brief interlude, that Eleanor allowed herself to be more than a silent queen. She conversed, she listened, she advised. Her presence was no longer an accessory to Louis's penance. It was its own subtle force, within the intricate dance of outrimmer diplomacy. But even this respite would not last. Louis, ever uneasy with the looseness of Antioch's court, began to see shadows where none existed. Whispers of impropriety, born more from political jealousy than fact, began to swirl. Chroniclers, eager for scandal, hinted at tensions between Eleanor and her husband, at the supposed impropriety of her closeness to Raymond. The truth, as always, was quieter and less dramatic. Eleanor was guilty only of wielding influence where Louis wished for silence. For a queen who had spent years in the suffocating etiquette of the Capetian court, Antioch had been a brief breath of air. But Louis, burdened by his insecurities and his clerical advisors, interpreted her independence as defiance. Their departure from Antioch was not triumphant. It was a retreat, but not in the sense that armies retreat. It was a withdrawal into silence. Eleanor resumed her role beside Louis, but the distance between them had become vast, unspoken. As they crossed the barren landscapes of Anatolia, their marriage trudged beside them, tired and strained. The campaign continued, through minor skirmishes, through ill-fated attempts at sieges, through the ever-mounting disappointments that marked the Second Crusade as a failure. Yet amidst the clamor of these defeats, Eleanor's resolve did not fracture. She had seen the brittle pride of kings. She had watched alliances unravel under the weight of their own ambition. And through it all, she remained a constant, observing presence beneath her veils, never loudly opposed and never openly challenged, yet never absent. The journey back to France was a slow undoing. For Louis, it was a return marked by the burden of failure. For Eleanor, it was a return with clarity. The crusade had revealed, in its slow erosion of certainty, how fragile the scaffolding of kingship could be. She had seen firsthand how kings blundered in their certainties, how battles were lost not through lack of courage, but through a failure to listen. And Eleanor had listened. She had learned. The whispers of annulment had already begun before their ships touched French shores. Their union, once lauded as the sacred joining of duchy and crown, had become a strained formality. Officially, their separation would be justified through consanguinity, a term that cloaked the deeper reality of their divergent ambitions. Louis saw the queen content with ceremonial piety. Eleanor sought a realm where her influence could breathe, die in the cold stone chambers of Paris. As petitions were drafted and alliances reconsidered, Eleanor's silences spoke louder than any decree. She did not storm from the court. She did not demand separation. She simply ceased to be pliant. She became a quiet stillness that unsettled, a presence too large to be ignored, yet too composed to be directly opposed. When the annulment was finally decreed in 1152, Eleanor's path seemed, to many, precarious. She was now a woman of 30. In medieval terms, a figure seen as past her prime, with 2 daughters and no male heir. But those who underestimated Eleanor had never truly seen her. They had mistaken patience for passivity, endurance for weakness. Barely 2 months after her release from the bonds of Louis' court, Eleanor would chart a new course, one that would unite her vast duchy with a rising star of the Plantagenet line, a young Henry of Anjou, whose ambitions were as restless as her own. But that story belongs to another passage of our quiet telling. The crusade, often remembered as a military failure, had been for Eleanor a quiet victory, not in the spoils of conquest, but in the subtle reaffirmation of her understanding of power. It was not the clash of swords that defined influence. It was the ability to endure, to remain composed amidst the noise, to watch kings falter while remaining quietly intact. As we leave Eleanor for now, picture her not in the grand halls of victory, but seated beneath the soft canopy of her tent, the desert night whispering through its seams. Her quill scratches softly against parchment, drafting letters whose ripples will extend far beyond the barren landscapes of the Levant. She is not a warrior queen. She is not a mere consort. She is something more enduring, a quiet force whose influence seeps slowly through the cracks of empires, that there's a particular kind of silence that settles in stone chambers. It is not an absence of sound, but a presence. A living, breathing stillness that fills the spaces between footsteps, between the rustle of parchment, between the soft exhale of a woman seated in solitude. For Eleanor of Aquitaine, this was the silence that defined her later years as Queen of England. Not the vibrant courtly life of her youth, not the restless campaigns of crusading Europe, but the quiet containment of imprisonment, a slow, suffocating, yet strangely potent existence behind closed doors. When Henry II ordered Eleanor's confinement in 1173, it was not with the spectacle of a public downfall. There was no trial, no formal deposition. There was simply the removal of freedom, the quiet ushering of a queen into a sequence of castles and manors where her world was reduced to cold walls, narrow windows, and the constant, tedious routines of household management. She was not cast into a dungeon. Henry was too politically astute for such crude displays. Instead, Eleanor's imprisonment was veiled in the formalities of house arrest, attended by a small, carefully chosen retinue, whose duty was as much surveillance as it was service. Her crime, if it can be called that, was not rebellion in the traditional sense. She had not raised an army herself. She had not ridden into battle against the king. But she had done something far more threatening to a ruler like Henry. She had lent her quiet support to their sons in their revolt against their father. In the intricate web of medieval power, Eleanor's endorsement was not a matter of words, but of presence. Her very association gave legitimacy to the rebellion, even as she sat in the background, never publicly denouncing Henry, never openly inciting. That was her way, influenced by association, by silent encouragement, by the subtle suggestion that perhaps the king was no longer the only center of gravity in the realm. Henry, for all his formidable rule, understood this quiet threat. He knew that Eleanor did not need swords to fracture loyalties. But her reputation, her network of alliances, her mere survival as a political figure, these were enough to unsettle his authority, and so he sought to contain her. But Eleanor had spent a lifetime mastering the art of endurance. Confinement, for her, became yet another chessboard, albeit one with slower, more deliberate moves in the long corridors of Old Sarum and the more comfortable chambers of Winchester and Sarum. Eleanor cultivated the slow craft of influence. Her days were filled with the ceaseless rituals of queenship, not the grand ceremonies of court, but the tedious, repetitive acts of patronage and correspondence. Each morning, as the light filtered through the narrow slits of her chamber, Eleanor would settle at her writing desk. The soft scratching of quills became the metronome of her days. Letters to loyal vassals, to abbots and abbesses, to distant cousins whose minor disputes could, with careful tending, evolve into subtle alliances. She did not need to be at court to play the game. The game, after all, was as much about patience as it was about presence. One must understand the tempo of medieval correspondence to appreciate Eleanor's quiet strategy. Messages were not dispatched with urgency. They traveled slowly, on horseback, by foot, across rivers and through forests, arriving weeks or months after they were penned. This delay, rather than a hindrance, became a tool for Eleanor. It allowed her words to arrive detached from immediate scrutiny, to be considered in the quiet spaces between larger political events. A letter from Eleanor, written in a tone of Concern or quiet counsel could plant a seed of doubt or bolster a flagging loyalty. Long after the initial turbulence had passed, within the rhythms of her confinement, Eleanor also maintained her role as patron of the arts. Minstrels, poets, and chroniclers still sought her favor, even in her isolation. Through them, Eleanor's legacy continued to ripple outward. Songs that celebrated the chivalric ideals of Aquitaine, poems that extolled the virtues of wise queenship. These were subtle instruments of influence, reinforcing her presence in the cultural fabric of England and France alike. To the casual observer, these were mere entertainments. But Eleanor knew the power of narrative. She understood that while kings issued decrees, queens shaped the stories that outlasted them. The seasons passed, each one folding into the next with the same quiet predictability. Autumn's rustle of drying leaves gave way to the muted hush of winter snow, which in turn softened into the damp grays of English springs. Through these cycles, Eleanor waited. She observed the slow fraying of Henry's alliances, the persistent restlessness of their sons, young men whose ambitions would not be tamed by their father's iron rule. Henry, for all his power, could not silence the passage of time. With each year, his grip tightened, but so too did the realm's weariness of his relentless control. Eleanor, behind her walls, became a symbol not of rebellion, but of endurance. She was the queen who had been wronged, yet remained composed. She did not wail against her confinement. She did not appeal publicly for release. She waited, and those beyond her walls, watching the slow drama of Plantagenet politics unfold, began to see her as a quiet alternative, a figure of balance against Henry's ceaseless tempest. When Henry's health began to fail in the early 1180s, the tempo of Eleanor's world subtly shifted. The letters became more frequent. The visits from trusted envoys, though always under the watchful eyes of Henry's guards, grew in significance. Every minor change in the court's favor, a lord's grievance, a bishop's complaint, passed through the quiet filter of Eleanor's patience. She offered no grand solutions. She promised no revolutions. But her presence, even in confinement, remained an axis around which many turned their thoughts. The death of Henry the Young King in 1183 marked a profound, if quiet, turning point. His passing, while tragic, unraveled the fragile balance of Henry II's succession plans. With Richard and Geoffrey pressing their claims, and John ever the king's favorite, looming on the periphery, the realm teetered in a slow, grinding tension. Through it all, Eleanor waited. Each funeral, each council, each whispered complaint against the king's overreach became, for her, another stitch in the unraveling fabric of Henry's authority. By the time of Henry II's final campaigns, his health diminished, his alliances splintered. The queen's quiet endurance had transformed from passive observation to poised readiness. The walls that had once confined her no longer seemed like barriers. They were simply thresholds, waiting for the right moment to open. And that moment came, not with fanfare, but with the soft creak of an old door, as Henry, beleaguered and broken, conceded to time and circumstance. When Henry died in 1189, the realm did not erupt in sudden change. There was no dramatic revolution. Instead, there was a quiet shift, like the slow turning of a key. Eleanor was released from her confinement, not in a triumphant procession, but with the calm formality befitting a queen whose influence had never truly left. She emerged, older, tempered, but not diminished. The years of patience had not eroded. Her will, they had refined it. Her son Richard, now King Richard I, recognized not only her enduring loyalty, but her unparalleled political acumen. While Richard would chase glory on crusade, it was Eleanor who would manage the kingdom in his absence. The woman who had been locked away for over a decade now found herself at the helm of the realm's governance. Trusted not because of newfound favor, but because she had quietly, patiently proven herself indispensable. Eleanor's years of imprisonment are often remembered as a pause in her influence. But the truth, as with so much in her life, is quieter, more enduring. Those years were not an interlude. They were a slow, methodical, cultivation of patience, of presence, of silent authority, and could not be extinguished by stone walls or royal decrees. She had outlasted Henry, not by opposing him directly, but by waiting for the tide of power to shift, as it always does. Given enough time, God, as we leave Eleanor's chamber behind, let us picture her not as a woman emerging from captivity, but as a queen who had never truly been contained. Her steps, measured and unhurried, echoed softly in the stone corridors. Each footfall a reminder that patience, when wielded with intent, is a force stronger than crowns and armies. There are stories of queens who wore their crowns lightly, as if power had been gifted to them by fortune's hand. Empress Matilda's story is not one of those. Her crown was a promise that was never fully fulfilled, a birthright she was forced to chase, step by slow step, across battlefields and through the suffocating labyrinth of medieval politics. Unlike queens who reigned from the heights of thrones, Matilda's influence was carved out in cold stone corridors and the long, breathless silences between negotiations. She was not a queen who conquered. She was a woman who outlasted Matilda, was born into a world where daughters were rarely heirs, but she was no ordinary daughter. The only surviving legitimate child of King Henry I of England, she had been raised with the gravity of dynastic expectation. Her early marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor had cast her into the grandeur of imperial courts, where she learned the formal, exhausting dances of European diplomacy. She was Empress of Germany before she had fully grasped the intricacies of power. Her days filled with ceremonies that seemed endless, processions of courtiers. The slow march of processional banners, the monotonous recitations of oaths and titles. These rituals, though tedious, became Matilda's early schooling in patience. But the empire, vast and cold, was only the first chapter. When the emperor died, Matilda returned to her father's realm, not as a widow to be pitied, but as an heir to be positioned. Henry I, having lost his only legitimate son in the tragedy of the White Ship disaster, had no choice but to declare Matilda his successor. He summoned his barons, demanded their oaths of fealty, and laid the groundwork for a succession that few truly believed would come to pass. A woman reigning in her own right, it was an idea met not with defiance, but with a softer, more insidious resistance. Disbelief. When Henry I died in 1135, his carefully constructed plans unraveled with quiet inevitability. His nephew, Stephen of Blois, charming and quick to act, seized the crown with the support of many who had sworn loyalty to Matilda. Their oaths, spoken with the gravity of formality, were undone by a shared, unspoken doubt that a woman, no matter how noble, could truly command the realm. And so began the slow unraveling of what history would call the anarchy, a civil war that was less a storm of battles and more a relentless, grinding struggle of wills. Matilda's claim was never theatrical. She did not sweep into England with armies singing of vengeance. She moved slowly, deliberately, gathering support not from grand declarations, but through the tedious, patient weaving of alliances. Her marriage to Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, was itself a calculated move, a union not of passion, but of quiet, strategic necessity. Through this marriage, Matilda would anchor her claim with continental strength, ensuring that her cause, though distant, was never extinguished in the early years of the Civil War. Matilda's presence in England was not marked by grand marches or dramatic sieges. Instead, she operated through proxies, her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, her loyal cousin the Earl of Leicester, and a scattered web of barons whose loyalty was tested not in fiery battles, but in the slow attrition of promises and negotiations. The rhythm of power was slow, almost glacial. Castles changed hands not through storming gates, but through months of quiet persuasion, of siege warfare where starvation was more potent than the sword. When Matilda finally landed on English shores in 1139, it was not as a conqueror, but as a claimant cautiously inserting herself into a fractured landscape. The court of Arundel Castle received her not with triumphant fanfare, but with polite uncertainty. The negotiations that followed were not the grand councils of kings, but hushed meetings in drafty halls, where loyalties were balanced on the thin edge of personal grievances and future gains. Matilda's path to power was marked by episodes of near victory, each one a study in the exasperating slowness of medieval politics. The most famous of these was her near coronation in 1141, after Stephen was captured at the Battle of Lincoln, a rare, decisive moment in an otherwise sluggish conflict. Matilda entered London with the expectation of a crowning that would legitimize her claim. Yet, even in triumph, the walls of resistance remained. The city, restless and uneasy under her command, turned against her not with swords, but with a sullen withdrawal of support. The barons, ever cautious, hesitated. The bishops, weighing their loyalties, withheld their blessing. And so Matilda's moment of victory slipped quietly through her fingers, not snatched away by force, but eroded by the slow, grinding reluctance of those who would rather wait than act out her retreat from. London was not a rout, but a slow, weary withdrawal. She was not chased by armies, but by the constant erosion of alliances. Every nobleman who rode away from her cause did so quietly. His departure marked not by defiance, but by the soft, suffocating weight of indecision. It was a war of inches, not miles, of whispered counsel, not rousing speeches, yet Matilda endured. The years passed, and though Stephen regained his throne, his rule was a fragile one. Every campaign against Matilda's supporters drained his coffers and eroded his standing. The kingdom was not torn apart by fiery rebellion, but by a slow, pervasive decay. Roads became unsafe, not because of grand battles, but because of countless petty skirmishes. Towns suffered, not from dramatic sieges, but from the ceaseless demands of warring lords extracting resources in the name of their chosen claimant. Through it all, Matilda remained a figure of quiet persistence. Her court, often itinerant, moved from stronghold to stronghold, a traveling hub of diplomacy where decisions were measured in weeks, not days. The act of holding a council was itself a laborious affair, the gathering of lords, the endless presentations of grievances, the careful balancing of favors and promises. Matilda listened, not with the impatience of a conqueror, but with the cold endurance of a woman who knew that every agreement, no matter how small, was a step toward an outcome that history would be too impatient to wait for by the mid-1140s. A struggle had settled into a stalemate. Neither Matilda nor Stephen could claim undisputed victory. But while Stephen aged, wearied by the ceaseless burdens of contested rule, Matilda's influence began to shift subtly. Her son, Henry Fitz-Empress, grew into his role as the new focal point of their dynastic claim. The narrative of Matilda's cause evolved, not through proclamations, but through the soft, persistent redirection of loyalties from mother to son. It was not a sudden transfer of power, but a gradual, almost imperceptible realignment, like the slow turning of a great wheel. When Stephen's son, Eustace, died in 1153, the scales tipped in Matilda's favor, not with the clangor of swords, but with the quiet acceptance of inevitability. Stephen, worn and politically isolated, entered negotiations with Henry Fitz-Empress. The Treaty of Winchester, which recognized Henry as Stephen's heir, was not a dramatic victory for Matilda. There was no coronation, no formal acknowledgement of her as queen. Yet, in that quiet agreement, Matilda's decades of persistence bore fruit. Her line would rule England. The crown that had been denied her would rest on her son's head. Matilda's story is not often celebrated in songs or epic tales. Her victories were not dramatic. Her defeats were not humiliations. She existed in the slow, exhausting middle ground where power is not seized, but slowly, patiently worn into shape. The English crown never touched her brow, but the Plantagenet dynasty, a line that would rule England for centuries, owed its very foundation to her relentless endurance. As she retreated from active politics in her later years, Matilda's life settled into a rhythm of advisory council and religious patronage. From her residence in Normandy, she continued to correspond with Henry II, offering guidance not in grand edicts, but in measured, thoughtful letters. Her influence had transformed from a public struggle to a quiet, behind-the-scenes presence. Even in retreat, she remained central, a constant, steady hand on the pulse of Plantagenet power. And so, Empress Matilda teaches us a lesson that is seldom celebrated in the grand narratives of history. Power in its truest form is not always about the crown one wears, but about the foundations one lays, stone by slow stone, and the long, silent corridors of endurance. She was a queen not of battles, but of patience. A ruler not of realms, but of legacies. When we think of civil war, we often imagine a realm torn apart in sudden bursts of violence, armies clashing beneath banners, the thunder of hooves across battlefields, the crack of siege engines against crumbling walls. But England's civil war in the mid-12th century, known to history as the Anarchy, unfolded with a very different rhythm. It was not a story of rapid conquest or dramatic uprisings. It was a war of patience, of attrition, of small, quiet sieges and long, tedious negotiations. For Empress Matilda, it was less a battlefield to be conquered and more a maze of stone walls and narrow passageways, through which she navigated with relentless persistence. The anarchy began not with a thunderclap, but with a murmur, the quiet shifting of loyalties following the death of King Henry the First in 1135. His chosen heir, Matilda, had been meticulously positioned to inherit the English throne. Oaths had been sworn, barons had given their solemn pledges. Yet, when the moment came, these promises dissolved into the mists of political expedience. Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, crossed the Channel in haste, securing his coronation before Matilda had the chance to assert her claim. His charm, his easy manner, won over many, but beneath the surface, the kingdom simmered with unease. Matilda, patient and deliberate, did not rush to England with legions. She watched, she gathered, she waited. Her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, became the linchpin of her cause, a man of military experience and political acumen. Together, they constructed a network of supporters, not through fiery rhetoric, but through the slow weaving of familial ties, mutual interests, and promises of future favor. The kingdom, divided by these quiet tensions, began to fracture, not in sudden explosions, but in a slow, creeping disintegration. The years that followed were not marked by sweeping campaigns. Instead, the anarchy unfolded like a long, exhausting chess match. Castles became the primary pieces, small stone fortresses scattered across the English landscape, each one a pocket of resistance or a bastion of loyalism. Control was not measured in vast territories, but in the possession of key strongholds, each painstakingly besieged, negotiated for, or quietly surrendered after months of attrition. Life during the anarchy was defined by this grinding stalemate. For the people of England, it was a time of uncertainty, but not always of open warfare. Roads became perilous, not because of massed armies, but due to the proliferation of petty lords and mercenaries, each claiming authority in the absence of central power. Villages might find themselves paying tribute to one lord in the morning, only to be extorted by another by evening. Lawlessness did not come in waves. It seeped into daily life, like a slow, inescapable fog. Matilda's campaign was never about dramatic offensives. Her strength lay in endurance, in the ability to persist through years of incremental gains and setbacks. She established her base in the southwest, particularly in the stronghold of Bristol, which became a hub of her operations. From there, her supporters spread her influence outward, not in sweeping conquests, but through the careful cultivation of alliances with local lords. Every letter sent, every negotiation held, was a stone laid in the foundation of her claim. One of the most emblematic moments of the anarchy came in 1141 at the Battle of Lincoln. It was one of the few instances where open combat decisively shifted the balance for a moment. Stephen, captured in the chaos of battle, was imprisoned. Matilda, for the first time, seemed poised to claim the throne. Yet, even in this victory, the slow pace of power politics prevailed. Her entrance into London was not a triumph, but a tense procession. The city's merchants, wary of committing to a new regime, withheld their support. The barons, as ever, hesitated, calculating the risks of aligning too openly with a woman claimant. Her failure to be crowned was not a result of military defeat, but of political inertia. The citizens of London, unsettled by her perceived arrogance, and the heavy taxation her court threatened, rose in quiet protest. Not a riot, not a rebellion, merely a withdrawal of welcome. Matilda, recognizing the fragile nature of her position, chose to withdraw rather than risk a confrontation that could unravel her gains. It was not a defeat in battle, but a setback in the slow, suffocating chess game that defined her struggle. Stevens. Released later that year, in exchange for Matilda's captured half-brother, marked the continuation of the stalemate. Neither side could deliver a decisive blow. The years that followed were a rhythm of sieges and skirmishes, of negotiations that seemed endless, of promises that were made, delayed, and often broken. Castles like Devizes, Oxford, and Winchester became focal points, not because they commanded vast regions, but because they symbolized footholds in a fractured kingdom. One of the most striking images from this period is Matilda's escape from Oxford. Castle in 1142. Trapped by Stephen's forces, the Empress was besieged in the snowbound fortress. Yet, rather than surrender, she chose endurance. In the dead of winter, cloaked in white, she slipped through enemy lines, crossing the frozen Thames under the cover of darkness. It was not a daring cavalry charge or a dramatic battle. It was a quiet act of survival, an emblem of the patience and resilience that defined her campaign. Throughout the anarchy, time itself became a weapon. Matilda understood that while armies could falter and battles could be lost, the slow erosion of Stephen's legitimacy was a continuous, relentless force. Every year that passed saw Stephen's authority weaken, his treasury drained by the ceaseless need to secure loyalty through gifts and grants, his alliances strained by the endless demands of war without resolution. Meanwhile, Matilda's position solidified, not through her own coronation, but through the rising prominence of her son, Henry Fitz-Empress. As Henry grew into adulthood, he became the living embodiment of Matilda's claim, a fresh face for the barons to place their hopes. Upon, unburdened by the controversies that had followed his mother. The transition of focus from Matilda to Henry was not announced in grand declarations. It was a quiet shift, one that unfolded in the whispered conversations of council chambers, in the soft rustle of letters exchanged between noble households stopped by. The early 1150s, the war had ground to a wearisome deadlock. England, exhausted by 2 decades of instability, began to seek resolution. Stephen, aging and politically isolated after the death of his son Eustace in 1153, faced the reality that his line could not secure the throne beyond his lifetime. The barons, fatigued by the endless cycle of conflict, leaned toward compromise, preferring the promise of stability over the continuation of a war that had long since lost its fervor. The Treaty of Winchester, signed in November 1153, was the quiet culmination of Matilda's struggle. It did not proclaim her queen, nor did it offer the dramatic vindication that history so often demands of its protagonists. Instead, it ensured that her son, Henry, would inherit the English throne upon Stephen's death. It was a victory not of conquest, but of endurance. Matilda's crown was never placed upon her own head, but the future she had fought for was secured. The anarchy teaches us that power is often less about decisive victories and more about the quiet, relentless act of outlasting one's opponents. It was a civil war in slow motion, a conflict defined not by its battles, but by its tedious negotiations, its endless sieges, its grinding uncertainty. For Matilda, every day she remained a viable claimant was a day closer to eventual success. Her influence, though rarely spotlighted in the chronicles of grand victories, was felt in every shift of allegiance, in every castle that quietly opened its gates to her cause, in every marriage alliance that tilted the scales of power ever so slightly in her favor. History remembers the anarchy as a period of lawlessness and chaos. But beneath that veneer lies the story of a woman who wielded patience as her sharpest weapon. As we leave Matilda's long, slow triumph behind, we turn next to another queen, Isabella of France. Her story, too, is one of endurance, of a quiet queen who watched, learned, and waited. Trapped in a marriage to a king who ignored her, Isabella's path to power would be forged not through battles, but through soft alliances and the careful orchestration of a quiet revolution. Hidden behind veils of decorum, victory often announces itself with fanfare, with crowns placed upon bowed heads, with cheering crowds, with tapestries and songs. But for Empress Matilda, the woman who had fought so long for a throne she would never sit upon, victory arrived quietly. There was no coronation, no triumphal procession. Instead, there was a subtle shift, a crown promised not to her, but to her son. A future secured through endurance, not conquest. Her legacy, like her life, was not drawn in bold lines, but in the soft, deliberate strokes of patience and quiet power. In the cold winter months of 1154, Stephen of Blois died, aged and wearied by the long, slow war that had drained his kingdom and his spirit. He had ruled for 19 years, not with unchallenged authority, but amidst constant doubt and disorder. His death marked not just the end of a reign, but the end of the anarchy. 2 decades of civil strife that had left the land bruised, yet not broken. Into this space stepped Henry II, the son of Matilda, a young man shaped by the careful guidance and persistent ambition of a mother who had fought, not for herself, but for his future. Matilda herself did not return to the forefront of courtly life with the accession of her son. Instead, she stepped back, retreating to Normandy, to a quieter existence, not one of obscurity, but of influence exercised from behind thick curtains and heavy wooden doors. Her residence at Rouen became a center of governance, a place where petitions were heard, letters dispatched, and policies quietly molded. There were no banners bearing her name, no statues erected in her honor. But her hand was in every missive, her voice echoed in every council. She was not queen, but she was the mother of a king, a role that, in the medieval world, held its own unique and subtle power. Her relationship with Henry was one of quiet collaboration. She did not seek to overshadow him, nor to direct his reign openly. Instead, she offered the wisdom of experience, the lessons learned through years of struggle, the understanding of court politics, the knowledge of alliances carefully built and maintained. Her letters to Henry, still preserved in fragments, reveal a tone not of command, but of calm counsel. She reminded him of obligations, urged patience where haste might have tempted, and guided him through the labyrinth of diplomacy with the gentle persistence that had characterized her own life in many ways. Matilda's legacy was not just Henry himself, but the dynasty he founded, the Plantagenets. This line, which would rule England for centuries, bore the marks of her influence. It was a dynasty forged in the crucible of the anarchy, tempered by the lessons of endurance and strength. Matilda had not only secured the crown for her son, but had imbued him with the qualities needed to hold it: resilience, political shrewdness, and a deep understanding of the slow, often tedious work of rulership. Matilda's presence in Normandy was more than a retreat. It was a deliberate act of governance. Normandy, long a source of wealth and power for the English crown, required steady hands. Matilda, experienced in both the German and English courts, brought a measured, competent authority to the region. She managed disputes between lords, oversaw, the administration of justice, and ensured the smooth collection of taxes, all with the same calm, deliberate pace that had defined her life. Her court was not a place of spectacle, but of order. The scratching of quills on parchment, the quiet murmur of advisors, the measured footsteps across stone floors, these were the sounds of her reign. She remained, even in these years, a figure of respect, not universally loved, but acknowledged for her endurance. Chroniclers, often dismissive of women in power, spoke of her with a cautious reverence. They did not crown her with praise, but they recorded her presence, her persistence, her role in the shaping of events. In the medieval world, where memory was fragile and history often written by those who had little reason to celebrate female authority, this quiet acknowledgement was in itself a form of victory. As the years passed, Matilda's role gradually diminished, not through loss, but through the natural progression of time. Her son, now a powerful king in his own right, expanded his territories, forged new alliances, and faced his own share of challenges. Matilda, ever watchful, ever measured, offered her counsel when asked, but did not press herself into the affairs of the English court. Instead, she found solace in the rituals of daily life, the soft rustle of robes during Mass, the cool touch of stone walls in her residence, the slow turning of pages as she read the Psalms by candlelight. Her later years were marked by reflection, not public, but private. She had seen kingdoms rise and falter, had known the cold of exile and the chill of castle walls. She had crossed mountains and rivers, had spoken in courts from Mainz to London, and had waited for years behind the heavy doors of negotiation chambers. Her life had not been one of great battles or grand spectacles, but of persistence. And in that persistence, she had shaped history. Matilda died in 1167, in Normandy, at the age of 65. Her burial was quiet, befitting the tone of her life, a resting place at the Abbey of Bec, not marked by excessive grandeur, but by a simple tomb inscribed with a humble epitaph. Great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest in her offspring. These words, understated yet poignant, capture the essence of her legacy. She had not seized the crown, but she had ensured its passage to her son. She had not ruled in name, but in influence, in the soft but firm shaping of a dynasty. Today, Matilda's story often lies in the shadow of her descendants, of Henry II, of Richard the Lionheart, of King John. Her name is not sung in ballads, nor is her image emblazoned on tapestries. Yet, the stone walls of the castles she once walked through still stand, the corridors where she whispered counsel, the parchment she once signed, the cold halls where she endured the slow turn of political fortunes. These remember her. Victory, in Matilda's world, was not a flash of glory, but a long, slow accumulation, a quiet presence in a loud world, a steady hand in turbulent times, a queen not in title, but in the legacy she carved out patiently. Behind closed doors, as we leave the quiet halls of Matilda's Normandy, we turn to another queen, Isabella of France. Like Matilda, Isabella waited. She endured, but her path led through different corridors, those of betrayal, of quiet revolution, of a marriage that became a political battlefield. In the next episode, we begin her story, where the flicker of candlelight illuminates the secrets of a queen determined to outwit her king. Marry a king was not always a blessing. For Isabella of France, daughter of Philip IV and queen consort, to England's Edward II, the gilded world of royalty became a cage of cold indifference. She entered her marriage with the expectations of a queen in waiting, a role defined not by overt power, but by quiet endurance. The union of England and France, sealed through her marriage at the tender age of 12, was meant to be a bond of peace between two rival crowns. Yet, beneath the layers of ceremony and silk, Isabella would find herself sidelined, humiliated, and forced into a life of waiting. Waiting for recognition. Waiting for influence. Waiting, above all, for the moment when quiet observation could be transformed into subtle action. Her arrival in England in 1308 was met with the grandeur expected of a royal bride. Processions lined the streets, and the walls of Westminster echoed with the solemn vows of coronation. Yet, even amidst the pageantry, there was a shadow upon her reception. Edward II, distracted and emotionally distant, lavished his attention not upon his new queen, but upon his favorite, Piers Gaveston. It was Gaveston who adorned himself with jewels meant for Isabella. It was Gaveston who stood beside Edward at the most intimate of ceremonies. The queen, veiled in brocade, became a symbol without substance, a political alliance reduced to formality. The court, too, was a labyrinth in which Isabella's presence was both essential and overlooked. The king's infatuation with his favorites, first Gaveston and later the Despencer family, pushed Isabella into the periphery. Yet, as she stood in the cold chambers of Edward's court, she began to learn the rhythms of quiet power. She observed the petty squabbles of barons, the shifting alliances that turned with the subtle nods of council meetings. There was no space for dramatic rebellion. Not yet, but there was space to listen, to watch, to endure. For years, Isabella occupied the role expected of her, attending ceremonies, offering soft-spoken counsel, bearing children. Her son, the future Edward III, was born in 1312. A political victory in itself, yet her position at court remained fragile. The king's inner circle tightened around him, his reliance on the Despensers growing more obsessive. Isabella's own lands and income were slowly stripped away, redistributed to curry favor with the Despencer family. The queen, once the symbolic bridge between France and England, found herself isolated within her own court, a guest in her own halls. Yet Isabella was not idle. Every slight, every humiliation was quietly noted. In the silent chambers of her private apartments, she began to weave her own web of alliances. The French court remained a source of latent power, a thread she would one day pull. English barons, disgruntled by the king's favoritism, found in Isabella a sympathetic ear, though she never voiced her displeasure openly. Her very presence, Ella undignified, became a rallying point for discontent. The years passed slowly. The rituals of queenship, the endless processions, the formal banquets, the ceremonial petitions became both a mask and a shield. Behind the veil of her duties, Isabella nurtured her quiet resistance. She was never loud, never confrontational. Her strength lay in her ability to outlast, to endure the cold silences of court life, to wait for the cracks in Edward's fragile regime to widen. The opportunity came not through battle, but through diplomacy. In 1325, Edward sent Isabella to France to negotiate a peace over the disputed territories of Gascony. It was a calculated decision, one that spoke to Edward's underestimation of his queen. He viewed her as a convenient emissary, a figurehead who would speak his words, nothing more. But once in France, Isabella stepped out of the confines of her enforced passivity. In the halls of her father's successors, she found allies willing to listen. In the company of Roger Mortimer, a powerful English noble who had fled Edward's persecution, she found a partner in strategy. It was not a romance spun from courtly love, but a partnership forged in mutual ambition. Together, Isabella and Mortimer crafted a plan not of open rebellion, but of quiet preparation. She refused to return to England while the Despensers held power, and from the safety of Parisian palaces, she began to gather support. Mercenaries, disillusioned nobles, and foreign sympathizers, all drawn into her slow, deliberate orbit. In 1326, when Isabella returned to England, it was not with a grand army, but with a carefully chosen force, small in number, but amplified by the discontent festering within the kingdom. The Despensers, once so secure in their influence, found themselves abandoned as the tide of baronial support shifted. Isabella's invasion was not a charge. It was a quiet, methodical march. Towns opened their gates, not out of fear, but out of a quiet, shared exhaustion with Edward's rule. Her movements were precise, her proclamations careful. She did not declare herself queen in defiance. She framed her actions as a necessary intervention, a correction, not a coup. Even in rebellion, Isabella adhered to the language of duty and propriety. Edward II, abandoned and betrayed, fled into the wilderness. His capture and the subsequent forced abdication were conducted with a formality that masked the enormity of the shift in power dot by early 1327. Isabella's son, Edward III, was proclaimed king, yet at 14 he was a king in name only. The true governance of England now resided with Isabella and Mortimer. As regent, Isabella found herself at the apex of power, not through a sudden conquest, but through years of patient endurance, through the careful crafting of alliances, and the subtle orchestration of political currents. Yet queenship, as Isabella knew, was never free from its own tides. Her regency was marked by the same rituals and formalities she had known for years. But now she bore the weight of decision-making. Petitions flooded her council chambers. Disputes among the nobility required delicate arbitration. Every choice, every decree was a balancing act. Power, as she had always understood, was not held in the grandeur of coronations, but in the exhausting daily management of a restless realm. The regency did not last indefinitely. Power in medieval England was always fragile, and by 1330, young. Edward III, eager to assert his independence, orchestrated the arrest of Mortimer and quietly sidelined his mother. Isabella, ever pragmatic, retreated into a life of quiet dignity. She was not exiled, nor imprisoned. Instead, she lived out her remaining years in relative comfort. Her influence waning, but never entirely erased, in her later life, Isabella became a figure of muted reverence. The scandals of her past, the whispers of rebellion and betrayal, faded into the background of her matronly image. She took solace in religious devotion, retreating to her estates, where the days passed in the soft cadence of prayer, correspondence, and the slow management of her household. Her legacy, much like Matilda's, was not found in grand monuments or songs of victory. It resided in the quiet shifts she had orchestrated, in the subtle ways she had reshaped the English monarchy. Edward III, whose reign would be marked by military triumphs and the flourishing of the English court, carried within him the lessons learned from his mother's quiet strength. The Plantagenet line continued through his descendants, bore the imprint of Isabella's calculated patience and diplomatic acumen. Isabella died in 1358, at the age of 63. Her funeral was not a grand affair of state, but a respectful, subdued ceremony. She was buried at Greyfriars Church in London, her body draped in the habit of the Poorclares, a final gesture of humility. Legend has it that she was buried with the heart of Edward II preserved in a silver casket, a romantic embellishment perhaps, but one that captures the strange, quiet intertwining of personal loss and political necessity that had defined her life. In the cold stone walls of medieval castles, history often remembers the loud, the kings who rode into battle, the barons who plotted rebellions, the wars that painted maps anew. But it is in the quieter corners, in the veiled presence of queens like Isabella of France, that the slow, patient reshaping of power often truly occurred. Her story is not one of dramatic confrontations, but of long silent observation, of endurance behind silken veils, and of the soft whisper of strategies formed in candlelit chambers. The Wars of the Roses, a conflict remembered in banners, battles, and bloodied fields, was for most a tale of kings and dukes, of shifting allegiances marked by heraldic symbols. Yet, in the hushed corridors of court, where the air was heavy with incense and the shuffle of velvet slippers echoed off stone, Margaret of Anjou waged her own war, not with swords or armor, but with patience, with letters, with alliances crafted in long, tedious councils. Her battleground was not Towton or Barnet, but the suffocating formalities of royal diplomacy. It was here, in the slow, deliberate pace of negotiation, that Margaret outlasted kings. Born in 1430 in Lorraine, a borderland where France and the Holy Roman Empire pressed against each other like the edges of ancient stones. Margaret's early life was steeped in the nuances of political survival. Her father, René of Anjou, held a tenuous grip on his titles, a minor king in name, a duke in reality. And from this precarious existence, Margaret learned the subtle art of endurance. Her marriage to Henry VI of England in 1445 was not the union of equals, but a diplomatic necessity. England, weary from its fading grip on French territories, sought peace. Margaret was the peace offering at 15. She entered the English court, a foreign queen with little dowry and no army. What she possessed was far more enduring. A keen mind sharpened by years of observing her family's quiet struggles for influence. Yet the court she entered was a cold one. Henry VI, pious and gentle, was a king more suited to monasteries than thrones. His moments of clarity were interspersed with long bouts of catatonia, and within these silences, the great lords of England began their own quiet civil war. The Duke of York, Richard Plantagenet, cast a long, ambitious shadow. The Neville family, with their sprawling influence, waited like hounds for a lapse in royal authority. Margaret, queen in name, found herself in a court where power slipped through her fingers the moment they dared to grasp it. But queenship, Margaret knew, was not about grasping. It was about enduring, about holding still, as others moved RASKLY. Her first victories were not bold proclamations, but quiet consolidations. She became a nucleus around which the Lancastrian loyalists could orbit. The king's illness, which rendered him incapable of governance, left a vacuum. Margaret filled this space not with noise, but with the slow, relentless work of courtly management. She attended every council meeting, though she spoke sparingly. She cultivated alliances, not with bribes, but with promises. Her presence became a quiet constant, a figure of stability in a court. A dread petition passed through her hands. Every envoy received her calm, measured words, yet the threat of Yorkist ambition loomed ever larger. Richard of York, emboldened by Henry's incapacitation, pressed for recognition as heir presumptive. Margaret, mother to a young son, Prince Edward, saw in this not merely a political maneuver, but a direct challenge to her child's future. The crown, which had once seemed secure, was now a fragile circlet balanced upon shifting sands. But Margaret did not meet this challenge with open defiance. She met it with endurance. As York's faction gathered strength, Margaret's response was not a grand declaration of opposition, but a quiet entrenchment. She built a network of loyalists. Through patient negotiation, each marriage she arranged, each title she confirmed, was a small, deliberate move in a larger, silent game. The Nevilles might boast of their armies, but Margaret held something more enduring, the weight of royal legitimacy, and the unwavering patience to wield it carefully. The years leading to open conflict were a series of slow, exhausting political maneuvers. Margaret traveled ceaselessly between estates, hosting banquets where every seating arrangement was a statement of allegiance. She listened to grievances, mediated disputes, and ensured that every noble who felt overlooked by York found a sympathetic ear in the Queen's chambers. It was a form of warfare, one that required no swords, only endurance. In these years, her influence was not shouted in the halls, but whispered along the corridors. When the fragile peace finally collapsed into battle, Margaret's role was still not on the battlefield. Instead, she worked behind the scenes, raising funds, negotiating alliances with foreign courts, ensuring that the Lancastrian cause remained viable even in defeat. After the loss at St. Albans in 1455, it was Margaret who refused to let the Lancastrian cause dissipate. She sent envoys to Scotland, arranged for French support, and leveraged every diplomatic connection at her disposal. Each letter dispatched was a quiet act of defiance. Each treaty negotiated was a step towards reclaiming what had been lost. Her resilience was tested as the tides of war ebbed and flowed. The court, once so dismissive of her presence, now saw Margaret as the true force behind the Lancastrian resistance. Yet she remained constrained by the formalities of her role. Queens did not ride into battle. Queens did not command armies. But queens could convene councils. Queens could write letters that bore the weight of royal authority. And so Margaret fought her war through ink and conversation, through the slow, grinding process of keeping a fractured cause stitched together. The birth of her son, Edward of Westminster, had been a beacon of hope for the Lancastrian line. But as battles were lost and lands were ceded, Edward's future seemed ever more precarious. Margaret's devotion to her son was not the fiery, impassioned love of romantic tales, but a fierce, cold determination. Every strategy she devised, every alliance she brokered, was done with his future in mind. She understood that for her son. To reign, she would have to endure countless small defeats, countless tedious negotiations. Before any victory could be within reach, the culmination of her patience came in the form of an unlikely alliance. In 1470, through the complex political recalculations of the Earl of Warwick, once her fiercest adversary, Margaret found an opportunity to restore the Lancastrian claim. Warwick, disillusioned with Edward IV, turned to Margaret in exile. The negotiations were slow, painful, and fraught with mistrust. But Margaret, ever the pragmatist, recognized the necessity of patience. She did not meet Warwick's overtures with triumphalism, but with the calm, measured pace that had defined her life. Their alliance, sealed through the marriage of Warwick's daughter to Margaret's son, was not a romantic reconciliation, but a calculated truce. A quiet nod across a council table, a shared recognition of necessity. Margaret's return to England in 1471 was marked not by fanfare, but by a quiet, deliberate disembarkation. She arrived not as a conquering queen, but as a political operator, poised to reclaim her son's future through careful maneuvering. But history, as Margaret well knew, is indifferent to patience. The Lancastrian cause suffered a final, brutal blow at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Her son was killed. The line she had fought so hard to preserve was extinguished in a moment. Yet, even in this, Margaret's legacy was not erased. The decades of endurance, the countless negotiations, had reshaped the political landscape. The notion that queens could be mere ornamental figures had been quietly dismantled. Margaret's capture after Tewkesbury did not strip her of dignity. She endured imprisonment with the same quiet fortitude that had characterized her entire life. In 1476, through the diplomatic intercession of the French crown, she was ransomed and returned to Anjou. There, in the quiet halls of her ancestral lands, she lived out her remaining years, away from the tumult of English politics. Her final days were not filled with regrets voiced loudly, but with the quiet satisfaction of one who had played the long game and had held the field, far longer than many of her adversaries. Margaret of Anjou's life was not a tale of battlefield triumphs. It was a testament to the exhausting, often overlooked labor of persistence. She wielded power not through conquest, but through relentless endurance. In the soft rustle of council petitions, in the long hours of diplomatic negotiation, in the quiet conversations behind heavy oak doors, these were her arenas of influence. She outwitted kings not through open confrontation, but through her refusal to be sidelined, through her ability to play the slowest, most tedious game of power, and to keep playing long after others had tired dot their regencies carved in. Triumph, where rulers grasp power with a flourish of proclamations and a gleam of crowns newly won. Isabella of France's regency was not one of them. Hers was a brief, muted rule, heavy with the suffocating weight of formalities, of balancing expectations in a court that resented her influence even as it depended upon her composure. It was not power seized in victory, but power endured in quiet, exhausting administration. By the autumn of 1326, Isabella had orchestrated the fall of her husband. Edward, too, not with swords drawn in public squares, but with the careful patience of alliances stitched together over years of whispered councils and ink-smeared correspondence. Alongside her ally and lover, Roger Mortimer, she had navigated the treacherous labyrinth of courtly politics with a relentless, calculating quietness. But Edward's downfall was not the end. It was merely the start of a new kind of burden. Ruling in the name of her son, the young Edward III, who was still a boy, too young to wear the crown without guidance. When Isabella stood at the heart of the English court as Queen Regent, she did not stand as a triumphant conqueror. She stood as a caretaker of a kingdom, of a legacy, of a fragile peace that needed constant tending. The act of regency was not a dramatic assertion of will. It was a slow suffocation beneath layers of protocol, of ceaseless petitions, of managing the fraying tempers of lords who resented a woman's hand upon the tiller of state, dot from the moment Edward II was deposed. The work began, the monotonous, relentless work of governance. Every morning, Isabella would sit in the cold, drafty halls of council chambers where the air hung heavy with the smell of beeswax and old vellum. She would preside over councils where every decision, no matter how small, was negotiation. Her voice, calm and measured, threaded through endless discussions about taxation, about trade agreements, about minor disputes between noble families whose grievances stretched back generations. The lords might grumble beneath their breath, but they listened. For Isabella had mastered the art of endurance, of outlasting their protests through the simple, steady application of patience. Her regency was defined by the weight of paperwork. The castle clerks, their quills scratching tirelessly against parchment, produced a steady stream of documents that demanded her attention. Charters to review, land disputes to mediate, trade tariffs to approve. There was no glamour in these tasks, but Isabella understood power was not exercised in grand declarations. It was held together by the mundane, by the ceaseless hum of bureaucratic machinery that could so easily grind to a halt if neglected, and yet she was never truly free. Behind her always stood Mortimer, a shadow as much as an ally. His influence was palpable, but it was Isabella who bore the formal weight of authority. The lords of England, wary of Mortimer's rising power, directed their criticisms at her. The same patience that had seen her through years of quiet opposition to Edward II was now turned inward, as she navigated the delicate balancing act of maintaining Mortimer's support while preventing his ambition from swallowing her own authority. Every council session was a performance, where Isabella's silence was as calculated as her rare, precise interjections. She knew when to defer, when to let Mortimer speak, and when to quietly reclaim the reins of control. Court life during Isabella's regency was suffocating in its formalities. Every step through the palace was measured, every entrance announced, by layers of protocol. She would glide through the stone corridors, her silken gown whispering against the cold flagstones, as nobles bowed with the faintest hints of reluctance. The court's public face was one of solemnity, but behind closed doors, every glance, every gesture, carried layers of unspoken calculations. Isabella was not merely managing. She was managing appearances, the illusion of stability in a realm still teetering from upheaval. One of her most enduring acts as regent was the stabilization of royal finances. The treasury, drained by years of Edward II's mismanagement, and the civil strife that followed, required meticulous attention. Isabella convened endless meetings, with her treasurers and clerks poring over accounts that detailed every coin collected and spent. There was nothing glamorous in these ledgers, only the slow, tedious arithmetic of governance. But Isabella understood the truth of queenship. Grandeur was built on the dull, unrelenting foundation of financial order, through subtle adjustments in taxation, careful management of royal lands, and the enforcement of long-ignored tariffs. She slowly steadied the crown's income. There were no parades to celebrate these victories. There were only the soft clinks of coin counted in the treasury halls, the faint creak of ledgers being closed after long hours of labor. But each balanced account was a quiet triumph, a small assertion that the regency was not merely surviving, but governing. The church, too, demanded her attention. The bishops, cautious of a queen regent wielding too much influence, sought constant reassurance that Isabella's rule would uphold ecclesiastical privileges. Isabella responded not with grand gestures of piety, but with quiet diplomacy. She attended religious councils, sat patiently through sermons crafted to test her orthodoxy, and signed charters confirming the Church's rights with a composed, unwavering hand. The Archbishop of Canterbury might have preferred a king upon the throne, but in Isabella, he found a regent who understood the value of deference and the quiet power that could be exercised within it. Yet, the regency was not without its moments of strain. The lords grew restless. Whispers of discontent echoed through the corridors. They murmured of Mortimer's unchecked influence, of Isabella's perceived favoritism, of decisions made behind veiled doors. But Isabella practiced, in the art of quiet endurance, did not meet their whispers with confrontation. She responded with the exhausting patience of formal court sessions, where grievances were aired in long, tedious proceedings, diffused by her calm, methodical mediation. Even as discontent simmered, Isabella maintained a deliberate distance from overt displays of power. She understood that her authority was a delicate construct, held together by appearances as much as policy. She did not stride through court with a warrior's confidence. Instead, she presided with the quiet dignity of one who had learned the strength of silence. Her power was not in the volume of her commands, but in the inevitability of her decisions, rendered after hours of patient listening. But the regency, like all things, was transient. Edward III, growing into his role, began to chafe against the constraints of tutelage. The transition of power from regent to king was not marked by a single moment of drama, but by a slow, inevitable shift. Edward's voice began to carry more weight in council. His presence, once that of a deferential air, began to assert itself with a quiet firmness. Isabella, perceptive as ever, recognized the changing tides. She did not cling to power with desperation. She did not stage a futile resistance. Instead, she began the slow, graceful process of retreating from the forefront, allowing her son to step into the light while she maintained a presence at the edges. A quiet advisor, a presence felt, but no longer dominant. The formalities remained, but the subtle dynamics shifted. Her regency was drawing to a close, not with a bang, but with a long fading echo. Yet, even in her withdrawal, Isabella understood the legacy of her brief reign. She had held England together in a moment of profound instability. She had navigated the suffocating formalities of court, the tedious negotiations of governance, and the constant undercurrents of political resentment. She had ruled not through bold proclamations, but through patience, through the slow, exhausting labor of managing a kingdom that would have gladly seen her fail. Her retreat from power was not a defeat. It was a deliberate, measured act, performed with the same quiet composure that had defined her regency. Isabella, Queen of England, once a pawn in foreign diplomacy, once a sidelined consort, had, for a time, held the levers of governance, not as a sovereign, but as a steward of continuity. Her reign was a soft, steady hand upon the helm, guiding the realm through turbulent waters until her son could take the wheel in the end. Isabella's regency was not a tale of conquest or revolution. It was a testament to the quiet endurance of governance, to the soft, unseen labor that sustains a kingdom through its most fragile moments. The world remembers the kings who rode into battle, the lords who shouted in council chambers. But behind them stood a queen who had outwitted them all, who had held power in the silences between their declarations. The story of Margaret of Anjou is not a tale of swift victories or heroic conquests. It is not the story of a queen whose name echoed in songs of triumph. Rather, it is the story of a woman who found herself at the heart of a war not of her making. A war where banners rose and fell with a weariness that echoed the endless ceremonies of court. The Wars of the Roses would be remembered for its battles, for its shifting allegiances, but for Margaret, the battlefield was not a place of swords and banners. It was the cold, echoing halls of negotiation chambers. It was the quiet persistence of letters, alliances, and the exhausting dance of diplomacy. Margaret was born into the shadow of power. Daughter of Rene of Anjou, she had grown up amidst the slow, ritualistic pace of the French court, where influence was not shouted, but whispered. When she was married to King Henry VI of England, she carried with her not a dowry of armies, but the quiet strength of a queen who had learned that endurance was its own form of power. Henry, frail in body and mind, was a king more suited to cloisters than to thrones. It was Margaret who would bear the weight of ruling, not by official decree, but by the slow, suffocating necessity of court life, her entrance into English. Politics was not marked by grand declarations, but by the endless formalities of queenship. Days blurred into weeks as she attended to ceremonies, received envoys, and fulfilled the tiresome rituals expected of a consort. Yet even in these mundane acts, Margaret watched, listened, and learned. She observed how the lords shifted in. Their allegiances, how a glance across a banquet table could carry more weight than 100 proclamations. She understood that her influence would not come from the throne. It would come from outlasting those who underestimated her. The court of Henry VI was a web of factions, each vying for control as the king drifted in and out of lucidity. Margaret, young and isolated, found herself maneuvering through this labyrinth with a patience born of necessity. She formed alliances not through grand speeches, but through the slow cultivation of trust, favoring those who showed loyalty not in public gestures, but in quiet support behind closed doors. Every petition she endorsed, every favor she granted, was a calculated move on the slow-moving chessboard of power. But the realm beyond the palace walls was restless. The nobility, weary of Henry's feeble rule, began to rally around Richard. Duke of York, a man whose lineage and ambition made him a natural figurehead for discontent. The kingdom drifted toward conflict, not with a sudden uprising, but with a creeping inevitability. As letters were exchanged, alliances formed, and old grievances reignited in hushed conversations. For Margaret, this was not a call to arms, but a call to patience. She did not rush to summon armies. Instead, she immersed herself in the exhausting work of diplomacy, sending emissaries, negotiating with wavering lords, weaving a fragile net of loyalty that could hold, at least for a time, when Henry's health faltered and his mind receded into silence. Margaret did not seize power with a proclamation. She simply stepped into the void left by his absence. It was an act of necessity, not ambition. The council chambers became her battlefield. She presided over meetings where every decision was a negotiation, where every word was weighed and measured. The lords might not have welcomed her authority, but they could not deny the vacuum that surrounded the throne. In these long, tedious sessions, Margaret learned that power was not about command. It was about endurance, about remaining seated. At the table, long after others had grown weary of the conversation as tensions escalated, the realm stumbled into open conflict, but even then, Margaret's war was not waged on the fields. While Yorkist and Lancastrian banners clashed, she remained in the background, orchestrating the logistics that sustained her cause. She organized the raising of levies, the gathering of supplies, the intricate arrangements of support from noble families whose loyalties were as fragile as parchment in a damp hall. Her influence was felt not in the shouts of commanders, but in the quiet rustling of maps, spread across council tables late into the night. Margaret's strength lay in her refusal to be rushed. Every decision was a slow calculation, every alliance a painstaking negotiation. She understood that her enemies expected her to falter under pressure, to react with the haste of desperation. Instead, she responded with the excruciating patience of someone who had endured years of court formalities. She knew that influence was not won in sudden victories, but in the slow, relentless turning of wheels behind the scenes. The Battle of St. Albans, the first armed clash of the Wars of the Roses, did not mark an end, but rather a new phase of Margaret's endurance. Though the Yorkists claimed a military victory, Margaret remained unmoved. She did not retreat into obscurity. She doubled down on her efforts, gathering her remaining supporters, rebuilding alliances that had frayed under the strain of conflict. She sent letters, arranged marriages, promised lands and titles, not in grand, sweeping gestures, but in a quiet, methodical persistence that defied the chaos of war. There were no parades for these efforts, no songs sung about the nights spent in dimly lit chambers, negotiating the loyalty of a wavering earl. But these were the battles that truly mattered to Margaret. She understood that as long as she could keep her faction intact, as long as she could delay the Yorkists' consolidation of power, the war remained unwon. Her son, Edward of Westminster, became the focal point of her cause. As the heir to the Lancastrian claim, he was a symbol around which she could rally her supporters. But even here, Margaret's influence was exercised through slow, strategic maneuvers. She arranged his betrothals with careful attention to political leverage, using his future marriage as a bargaining chip in the intricate game of noble alliances. Every potential match was weighed not for its romantic prospects, but for its capacity to bolster her dwindling network of support. Margaret's life became a constant cycle of counsels, petitions, and quiet persuasions. She would sit through hours of discussion, listening to the grievances of lords, the demands of allies offering small concessions, promising future rewards. There was no glamour in these exchanges, no dramatic declarations. But with each agreement, each carefully managed negotiation, she extended the lifespan of her cause by another month, another season, even when forced into exile. First in Scotland and then in France, Margaret did not abandon her quiet campaign. The sea might have separated her from England, but her influence traveled through letters carried by trusted envoys. In the cold stone halls of foreign courts, she continued her quiet diplomacy, appealing to old allies, securing financial support, never allowing the flickering embers of her faction to die out completely. Her time in exile was not marked by bitter retreat, but by ceaseless, exhausting work. She did not pace the halls in anger. She sat with scribes, drafting appeals, negotiating loans, arranging the minutiae of political promises. The court of Anjou, though distant, became a hub of Lancastrian coordination, a quiet nerve center from which Margaret continued to orchestrate her slow, deliberate resistance. Margaret's return to England, leading a Lancastrian resurgence, was not a triumphant procession, but a cautious, calculated gamble. Every step was negotiated, every movement shielded by a web of fragile alliances. She led not as a general, but as a steward of her cause's survival, ensuring that each engagement, each temporary gain, was leveraged to extend her position in the protracted struggle. Yet, history does not often remember the quiet labor. Endurance. The chroniclers focused on battles, on Toten, on Tewkesbury, moments of clash that overshadowed the years of relentless, grinding political maneuvering that Margaret had endured. They remembered the armies, but forgot the endless negotiations that raised them. They remembered the losses, but overlooked the remarkable patience that had sustained her campaign far longer than any. Expected Dot as the tides of fortune turned against her, and as her son fell in battle, Margaret's role diminished not through a dramatic fall, but through the slow erosion of influence. Yet, even in retreat, she remained a figure of quiet resilience. She returned to France not in disgrace, but with the quiet dignity of one who had played a long, thankless game, one where victory was measured not in crowns, but in the mere ability to endure, to outlast, to resist until the final breath dot in a grand sweep of history. Wars are remembered for their battles. Chroniclers fixate on the clashing of armies, the banners unfurling in the wind, the brief, brutal moments where the future of a kingdom is supposedly decided in a single day. But for Margaret of Anjou, the Wars of the Roses were not fought in the blaze of sudden battles. They were fought in the endless quiet of negotiations. in chambers where the air was heavy with the smell of beeswax and old paper. Her victories were not won in fields, but in the fragile agreements forged after hours of patience, where the scratch of a quill held more power than a sword. After the disastrous defeats that scattered the Lancastrian cause, Margaret found herself in a position familiar to so many medieval queens, sidelined, underestimated, yet far from powerless. She had retreated from the battlefield, but not from the intricate web of political maneuvering that remained her true arena. In exile, first in Scotland and then in France, she resumed the ceaseless labor of a queen without a throne. A role, not of spectacle, but of endurance. The negotiations were never ending. They blurred into a monotonous rhythm, days spent drafting letters, evenings passed listening to cautious promises, nights weighed down by the fragile hope that another alliance, another loan, might buy her faction a little more time. There was no glamour in these efforts. The courts of Europe were not eager to entangle themselves in England's civil strife. Every meeting was a battle of persistence, where Margaret would present, with quiet insistence, the legitimacy of her son's claim, the righteousness of her cause, and the mutual benefit of aiding her return to power. She became a master of the soft sell. There were no fiery speeches, no grand appeals to chivalric duty. Instead, Margaret worked through the slow accumulation of favors. She understood that politics in exile was a matter of patience, that every minor noble persuaded, every small sum of gold secured, was a thread in the broader tapestry of resistance. The negotiations were delicate, like walking across a thin layer of ice, where one misstep could see the entire effort vanish beneath cold waters dot in the dimly lit chambers of the French court. Margaret would sit, hour after hour, as envoys came, and when each requiring a different kind of persuasion. Some responded to promises of future titles, lands that she no longer controlled but spoke of with quiet certainty. Others needed assurance of tangible returns, subtle hints at trade agreements, or quiet gestures of gratitude that came in form of fine tapestries, rare books, or promised marriages. Every conversation was another stitch in the fragile garment of her campaign. A garment that could unravel with a single pull. Margaret's negotiations extended beyond mere words. She arranged marriages with a strategic precision that was both exhausting and necessary. Each match she proposed was not simply a union of two individuals, but a calculated move on the political chessboard. A marriage alliance could turn a wavering ally into a firm supporter, could tie the fortunes of an entire noble house to the Lancastrian cause. Yet these arrangements were never simple. They required long, tedious discussions about dowries, inheritances, and future claims, matters that dragged on for weeks, sometimes months. Over tables cluttered with scrolls and wax seals, money, too, was a constant preoccupation. Raising armies required funding, and Margaret became adept at the subtle art of securing loans without the immediate means to repay them. She had learned the careful language of deferral, the art of promising future returns while offering small tokens of good faith in the present. It was not an easy task. Many potential benefactors were wary of investing in a cause that seemed perpetually on the brink of collapse. But Margaret's persistence was unyielding. She knew that survival depended not on overwhelming support, but on the accumulation of many small commitments, each insignificant on its own, but collectively powerful. Every day was a negotiation. With foreign courts, with noble families, with merchants who controlled the flow of supplies. Even within her own dwindling circle of Lancastrian loyalists, she had to manage delicate egos, soothe frayed tempers, and hold together a coalition of men who saw every setback as a reason to abandon the cause. Margaret's strength lay in her refusal to waver. She sat through every tedious council meeting, listened to every grievance, responded with the same quiet firmness that had sustained her through years of court life. Margaret's method was not to command, but to persist. She understood that in a war of attrition, the side that could endure the longest often won, not through a decisive strike, but because their opponents grew weary and careless. She outlasted the impatience of others. Where men grew frustrated by the slow pace of diplomacy, Margaret remained unmoved, continuing to draft letters, send envoys, and attend endless rounds of negotiations with the same steady determination. It was in these long, monotonous negotiations that Margaret's true skill as a queen emerged. She knew when to remain silent, allowing her opponents to speak themselves into a corner. She knew how to use pauses, long, deliberate silences that compelled the other party to fill the void, often with concessions they had not intended to make. Her conversations were less about persuasion and more about wearing down resistance, like water slowly hollowing stone. Even as her resources dwindled and the tide of war seemed to tilt inexorably against her, Margaret never allowed the appearance of defeat to seep into her negotiations. She maintained the facade of inevitability, the quiet confidence that her son's claim was not a matter of possibility, but of eventual certainty. This unwavering posture unsettled her opponents, who expected despair and found instead the same calm, methodical persistence that had defined her queenship. But history, in its rush to chronicle battles and bloodshed, rarely records these endless meetings, these slow, grinding victories of negotiation. There are no epic poems about the hours Margaret spent poring over letters, or the countless evenings she spent in dimly lit halls, listening to cautious allies hedge their support. Yet, these were the true battlegrounds of her reign. Every small concession gained, every wavering lord convinced to offer resources, was a victory as significant as any won on the field. Her negotiations extended even to the personal level. Margaret was skilled at turning personal interactions into political leverage. A courteous gesture at a banquet, a whispered word during a procession, could lay the groundwork for future support. She understood the importance of presence, of being seen as composed, determined, unbroken, even when the pressures of exile threatened to crush her spirit. The image of the steadfast queen was as much a tool in negotiations as any formal treaty, yet, for all her efforts, the limitations of quiet power became increasingly apparent. There were moments when Margaret's intricate web of alliances was simply not enough to counter the brute force of the Yorkist ascendancy. Still, she continued. She negotiated not for grand reversals of fortune, but for survival, for another campaign, another shipment of supplies, another chance to keep her cause alive amidst the chaos. As the years wore on, these negotiations became acts of sheer endurance. Margaret persisted not because victory was assured, but because the act of continuing was itself a form of defiance. In a world that expected queens to fade into silence after defeat, she remained an active force, a reminder that power did not always shout. Sometimes it merely endured, quietly, insistently, behind closed doors. In the end, history would remember the Wars of the Roses for its decisive battles. Towton, Barnet, Tewkesbury, names that echoed through chronicles and songs. But beneath these loud moments, there was a quieter story, a story of a queen who fought a war of words and wills, who wielded patience and persistence as her weapons, and who kept her cause alive through sheer, unyielding endurance. And though Margaret of Anjou's cause would ultimately falter, her legacy was not one of failure. It was a legacy of quiet resistance, of a woman who refused to accept the limits placed upon her, who continued to negotiate, to bargain, to endure, long after others had given up. The endless negotiations were not glamorous, but they were her true battlefield, where she demonstrated a strength of will that outlasted kingdoms. In the quiet after the storm, when armies had scattered and banners lay crumpled in the mud, there remained only the long, hollow silence of exile. For Margaret of Anjou, the final chapter of her political life unfolded not in the chaos of council chambers or the murmur of negotiation tables, but in the slow, mournful drift of years spent waiting in foreign lands. The fall had come not with a sudden, shattering defeat, but with the slow unraveling of the fragile alliances she had so painstakingly maintained. The Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471 was For many, the end of the Lancastrian cause. For Margaret, it was the quiet, devastating punctuation mark at the end of a lifetime of endurance. Her son, Edward of Westminster, the Prince of Wales, her pride, her purpose, was dead. Struck down not in a grand duel, but amidst the cold, chaotic brutality of battle, his death severed the final thread that had tethered Margaret's relentless diplomacy to a tangible future. The dream of a restored Lancastrian dynasty, of her son upon the throne of England, dissolved into the muddy fields of Tewkesbury. As banners drooped and loyalists fled, yet, in keeping with the quiet resilience that had defined her life, Margaret did not rage, did not collapse in a dramatic display of grief. Instead, she retreated first into custody of Edward IV, and then, through a series of negotiations, back to the land of her birth. France welcomed her, not as a queen regnant, but as a woman who had spent herself entirely in the exhausting pursuit of power. She returned not to the vibrant courts of her youth, but to a world grown colder, more indifferent, where the once prized alliances had faded into diplomatic afterthoughts. Exile was not new to Margaret. She had tasted it before, during the turbulent years of the Wars of the Roses, but this exile was different. It was final. There were no more envoys to dispatch, no more promises to extract from hesitant allies. The cause had slipped beyond her, grasp, and with it, the ceaseless activity that had filled her days. What remained was the waiting, the long, empty hours of reflection, where memory was both a comfort and a cursed dot in the quiet solitude of Anjou. Margaret's days settled into a rhythm as slow and deliberate as the soft ticking of an unseen clock. The mornings brought the same routine, a silent procession of attendants, the careful laying out of veils and gowns, the measured pace of her steps across cold stone floors. She would walk the halls of her modest residence, the echo of footsteps, a faint reminder of the courtly procession she once commanded. But now there were no petitions, no councils, no whispering nobles awaiting her audience. Only the endless stretch of time, heavy and unmoving. The letters still came, though they were fewer now. Occasional news from former allies, brief mentions of political shifts in England that no longer concerned her. She would read them with detached patience, her eyes scanning the parchment without the urgency that once accompanied every scrap of intelligence. The names had changed. The battles were no longer hers. Yet, even as history moved forward, Margaret remained a solitary figure in a story that had passed her by. Exile, for a queen, was a strange form of half-existence. Stripped of courtly duties, yet still bound by the rigid etiquette of her station. Margaret lived in a world where every action was performed out of habit rather than necessity. The formalities continued, the daily masses, though meticulously prepared. Meals, the perfunctory exchanges with attendants who no longer served the ruling monarch. Power had faded, but the rituals remained, like the faint lingering of incense in an empty chapel outside her chambers. Life in Anjou continued with its quiet, provincial rhythm. The fields ripened with the seasons. The river flowed past with indifference to the shifting tides of English politics. Occasionally, Margaret would venture into the gardens, her steps slow and deliberate, as if the earth itself demanded respect for every movement. She would pause beneath the aged trees, her gaze lingering not on the blossoms, but on the spaces between them, spaces filled with memories of war councils, of alliances forged over maps spread across tables, of whispered promises and candlelit corridors. Yet, amidst the monotony of exile, Margaret's mind remained sharp. She had spent her life navigating the slow grind of medieval power, and now, even in the absence of political ambition, her thoughts moved in familiar patterns. She would recall the intricacies of old negotiations, analyzing them with a detached clarity that had been impossible in the heat of their moment. She reflected not on battles, but on the long, tedious campaigns of diplomacy, the endless negotiations where victory had been measured in concessions and compromises, in the slow shifting of loyalties rather than swift conquests. Margaret's exile was not entirely devoid of purpose. She had debts to settle, arrangements to oversee, legacies to consider. Though her son was gone, the tangled web of Lancastrian affiliations lingered, and she maintained correspondence with those who still bore her family's crest. There was a quiet dignity in her persistence, an unspoken acknowledgement that a queen's influence did not simply vanish with the loss of her crown. Even in obscurity, there remained a duty to the echoes of former power.